The topic of this painting exercise is aerial perspective, which is a fundamental element in landscape painting. It's a useful tool for creating the illusion of depth in space. So what is aerial perspective? Well, as objects such as mountains or buildings move further away from you in space, they become lighter and they take on the color of the atmosphere. So if it's a clear day and the sky is blue, distant objects will start to look more bluish as they go further away from you. Also, contrasts between lights and darks become weaker as objects disappear into the distance. Before I start my painting, I want to plan out what I'm going to be doing. In the planning stages, I will be examining the following topics: grounding the canvas, complementary colors, and palette organization. I first want to prepare my canvas with a toned ground. I find that a white ground tends to make colors seem too dark when I start painting. A neutral colored ground, set at a middle tone, lets me judge the saturation, the light and dark tones of my colors with greater ease. Working with burnt sienna oil paint, I thin it down with a lot of solvent, and I quickly apply it to the canvas. Afterwards, I take a clean dry rag and I start wiping down the surface. I will repeat this step several times, and each time more paint is lifted off. When I'm done, I should have a canvas which is almost dry to the touch and nicely toned. Next, I want to study the subject and begin to visualize how to interpret the colors. I'm first concerned with the tonal structure, that is, the way the lights and darks are composed. A useful way to gauge the tonal structure is to imagine the subject as a black and white photo. With practice, you'll be able to automatically make the translation of color to tone, but a black and white image is a useful tool to learn from. In this image, each mountain top gets progressively lighter as it moves off into the distance. This means that my palette should have tones that are graduated from dark to light. In terms of color, the mountains go from dark brown to a paler grayish brown. There's a pale orange hue in the clouds, and then the blue of the upper atmosphere. So, I've just named my principal colors: brown, orange, and blue. Now I have to translate them into actual pigments. I've chosen to use ultramarine blue and cadmium orange, which are complementary colors. Here's a quick review of complementary colors. Complementary colors have three functions. When mixed together, one complement will darken the other. When mixed together, one complement will decrease the saturation of the other, and when laid side by side, there will be a maximum contrast in color. Here's a list of the primary complementary pairs: cadmium yellow light, dioxazine violet; cadmium orange, ultramarine blue; cadmium red light, phthalo blue; alizarin crimson, and phthalo green. Let's take a look at how this works with paint pigments, cadmium orange and ultramarine blue. As I mix one complement into the other, each one becomes more neutralized. I am, in effect, decreasing the saturation of each color. In the case of orange, I'm also darkening it significantly as I add blue to it. So, when complements are mixed together, they neutralize each other. Orange becomes brown, blue becomes gray. On my palette, I have a complementary color scale which shows this more clearly. It is useful to then add white to these color mixes in order to visualize what happens to them. The result is a nice palette of neutral colors in many different tones. Notice how I've organized my palette, or notice how organized my palette is. This is extremely important when you're painting. If you can be organized and systematic with your base materials, you can use them and paint with greater ease. Here's the palette that I have mixed out to prepare for this particular painting. The colors are based upon the complements that I just showed you. Notice how the colors are arranged. Each color is mixed out in graduated tones, and each color group is kept separate from the other. There's enough room left on the palette to intermix different tones of the same color, and also to intermix the different colors. Here's my palette at the end of the painting. You can almost see the whole painting laid out in front of you. The center of the palette has the neutralized oranges, which are used for the mountains. The left of the palette has the various tones of ultramarine blue for the sky, and to the right of the palette there are the pale cadmium oranges mixed with cadmium yellow for the clouds. This initial stage of preparation is extremely important and often quite time-consuming. First, I study my subject in order to understand the color structure. Then I translate my observations into actual pigments. By mixing colors out on the palette beforehand, I'm able to visualize the different planes of the painting, the foreground mountains, the middle ground mountains, and then the clouds and the background sky. Now I can start to paint.